At about 6:30 p.m. on the 8th of September, Londoners heard a huge double boom. A massive pall of smoke rose above Chiswick in West London. The public was told that the detonations had been caused by an exploding gas main. But the British War Cabinet knew better. The devastation in Chiswick heralded the arrival of a new revenge weapon. The V2 rocket. The history of the V2 is intertwined with the lives of two men, the professional soldier, Walter Dornberger, and the brilliant young technocrat, Wernher von Braun. In the late 1920s, von Braun's youthful enthusiasm for the idea of space travel had been channeled into the practical business of rocket experiments. While a student at the Berlin Technical College, von Braun attended trials held by the German Rocket Society. When in 1932 the society folded, von Braun found employment with the Army Weapons Department as a technical assistant in the rocket section, investigating liquid fuels. Under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, signed after Germany's defeat in the First World War, the German army was forbidden heavy artillery, but rockets had not been prohibited. The German army's rocket man was Walter Dornberger, an artillery expert. In his memoirs, Dornberger recalled that by the early 1930s, artillery's highest achievement had been the massive Paris gun. This monster fired a 21-centimeter shell armed with 25 pounds of high explosive about 60 miles. My idea of a big rocket was something that would send a ton of high explosive over 160 miles. In 1932, Dornberger joined forces with von Braun to develop rockets for a small unit of the Army Weapons Office. Dornberger gave von Braun a list of requirements, among them a stipulation that for every 1,000 feet of range, a deviation of only 2 or 3 feet from the chosen point of impact was acceptable. He also limited the size of the rocket by insisting that it must be transported by road and that its transporter must not exceed the maximum width laid down for road vehicles. Dornberger had been remarkably prescient. His demands had anticipated the transportable ballistic missile, which, 30 years later, would become one of the most important elements in the superpowers' arsenals during the Cold War. When Adolf Hitler came to power in Germany in January 1933, a fresh twist was given to the rocket program. Hitler was committed to a program of rearmament. It was launched in secret. But after 1935, it was pursued openly. Not only did the program alarm Germany's neighbors, but it also aroused the deepest concern within the German military high command. They feared that the Wehrmacht would be unable to cope with its breakneck speed. But one of the grateful beneficiaries was the rocket program, led by Dornberger and von Braun. In 1937, they were given the funds for a testing station on Peenemünde, a remote Baltic island. Here they busied themselves with the development of the V2 rocket, known to the Germans as the A4. At the other end of the island, the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, was to develop the V1 flying bomb, designated FZG-76. Against the background of a deepening European crisis, the scientists and technicians at Peenemünde pressed ahead with the V2 program. Scaled-down prototypes were successfully tested. The future looked rosy for Dornberger and von Braun. parachutes ensured that the prototypes were recovered from the sea. The enthusiastic von Braun was happy to strip off and help manhandle the dwarf V2s to the shore. On the 1st of September 1939, Hitler's invasion of Poland was preceded by aircraft of a more conventional type than von Braun's fledgling rocket. The Polish Air Force, first dispersed and then decimated, was brushed aside by the Luftwaffe. The German army overran Poland in 6 weeks. It was the first demonstration of blitzkrieg, or lightning war. Even before the Poles had formally surrendered, Hitler had arrived in the port of Danzig to make a speech to his victorious generals. He announced that he possessed a mystery weapon, which would place Germany in an unassailable position. But if the Führer was making an oblique reference to the V2, his enthusiasm was short-lived. For he soon ordered a cutback in the rocket development program. Albert Speer, later his armaments minister, reflected that had the V2 been deployed earlier, it might have played a crucial role.
We had no bombers which could reach England with a heavy load, and there was something which was not, there was no defense against it, and if we would have succeeded to bring maybe a few hundreds a day to London for a while, then it would have been a great shock.
Far from Peenemünde, however, the tide of war was turning against Hitler. In North Africa in 1942, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel suffered a decisive defeat at the Battle of El Alamein. In Russia, the German 6th Army was about to be swallowed up in the struggle for Stalingrad. In the Stalingrad campaign, German losses amounted to 1.5 million men. 100,000 men of 6th Army survived to march into captivity. This disaster brought a greater urgency to the German rocket program. In October 1942, as the tragedy was beginning to unfold, von Braun and Dornberger staged a successful firing of the V2. For Albert Speer,
suddenly there was a huge noise and a tremendous shivering of the soil. I must say it was one of the biggest impressions I had in my whole life. Since this huge missile was against all rules of gravity, lifting slowly, and then faster and faster, and with the thunder was disappearing in the clouds.
In December 1942, Speer gave the order to begin the mass production of the V2. But it was not for another 6 months that Hitler was treated to a film of the test firing of von Braun's rocket. It made a vivid impression on the Führer. Hitler declared the rocket to be the decisive weapon of the war. Nevertheless, the continuing test program at Peenemünde indicated that von Braun's rocket was still a fragile weapon of war. The neighboring Luftwaffe base was in the firing line rather than London. It was in London that a picture of the German rocket program was now being pieced together. The man at the center of the drama was a brilliant young scientist, Dr. R.V. Jones. In the mid-1930s, Jones had been involved with research into the use of infrared for the detection of aircraft. From this work, it was a short step into the team pioneering the development of the British radar system, which was to be the vital factor in securing victory in the Battle of Britain. Jones was to become a key figure in the world of scientific intelligence. At the Air Ministry, his role was that of watchdog, anticipating and investigating what his German opposite numbers might be up to. Jones and his team were instrumental in detecting and disrupting many German electronic warfare systems, notably the radio navigation beams which guided the Luftwaffe's bombers to their targets during the Blitz. Jones was fighting an unheralded war of the utmost secrecy and utmost importance to the Allied war effort. In 1940, Jones and his team had played a key role in Britain's survival. Their judgment was about to be tested again. For Jones had begun searching the files of the Secret Intelligence Service for clues as to what Hitler's mystery weapon might be. The files were lodged in the Government Code and Cipher School at Bletchley Park. This placed Jones at the heart of British wartime intelligence. At Bletchley, Jones concluded that Germany did not as yet possess the decisive weapon at which Hitler had hinted. He drew up a list of possibilities to which intelligence should remain alert. Number 5 was long-range guns and rockets. While he was still at Bletchley, Jones was handed a package which had been delivered to the British Embassy in Oslo. This had come from an anonymous well-wisher, and it contained a detailed letter which became known as the Oslo Report.
And the letter purported to come from somebody who wished us well, who, if one could believe it, knew a great deal about German research developments. And he said there were a number of things going on. He told us about the Ju-88 being used as a night fighter, as a dive bomber, for example. He mentioned Peenemünde. He also mentioned that they were developing large rockets, although he didn't actually say they were being done at Peenemünde. And it was the first mention we'd had of Peenemünde. He also told us about the development of pilotless aircraft that was going on.
The V-weapons were not the only fruit of this research. The Germans were developing a remotely controlled rocket-driven glider, which in 1943 was to be used against Allied shipping in the Mediterranean. Jones's superiors, including Lord Cherwell, were convinced that the Oslo Report was a plant. Jones thought otherwise. In December 1942, British intelligence received a message from an engineer in Denmark that the Germans had developed a rocket capable of carrying 5 tons of explosives over a minimum range of 175 miles. A second report from Sweden stated that these weapons were being manufactured at Peenemünde. Then, in March 1943, the intelligence breakthrough arrived. It came from an unexpected source: 2 German generals captured in North Africa. General Ludwig Kruvel had been Field Marshal Rommel's second-in-command until May 1942, when he was taken prisoner by the British. General Wilhelm Ritter von Thoma, one of Rommel's ablest panzer commanders, had been captured during the closing stages of the Battle of El Alamein. He had paid his respects to his captor, General Montgomery. Both of these high-ranking prisoners of war found themselves sharing the same quarters outside London. Unknown to them, their conversations were closely monitored. In March 1943, von Thoma told Kruvel that no progress had been made in the rocket business. Kruvel observed that the absence of explosions suggested a delay in the program. Jones pounced.
At that point, my Deputy Charles Frank, who I remember it was Saturday afternoon, he was just sitting opposite me, just as you are here, you see, and he suddenly looked up from reading the interrogation report and said, "Look, we better take those rockets seriously." And from that point onwards, the whole temper of the story changed.
Jones had picked up the scent, but there were others on the trail. The British chiefs of staff were also alarmed by the rocket threat. They appointed Duncan Sands, the future government minister, to chair a new committee to assess the threat. Sands was the man of the moment, Jones seemingly forgotten. It was the start of a bitter interdepartmental feud. But Jones retained an interest in the rocket program through air intelligence and his role with MI6 as advisor on the direction of its agents' activities in occupied Europe. This gave Jones access to aerial reconnaissance photographs, albeit after Sands had seen them. In June 1943, 2 reports set alarm bells ringing. They came from Luxembourgers who were working at Peenemünde as part of an army of foreign conscripts. Both mentioned rockets. The RAF's Photographic Reconnaissance Unit, or PRU, had close links with R.V. Jones. Aircraft were dispatched to photograph the plant at Peenemünde. On the 18th of June 1943, Jones finally found a rocket on a photograph of Peenemünde. A week later, another photograph gave Jones a clearer picture of his elusive quarry. The rocket seemed real enough. On the 29th of June, Jones attended a meeting of the War Cabinet Defense Committee.
It was one of those night meetings. It started at 10 o'clock at night, and most of us came in and seated ourselves, and then Winston himself came in, and the meeting opened with Winston asking Duncan Sands to review the evidence for the rocket and the prospective countermeasures. And Duncan Sands, having reviewed the evidence, I thought a little strongly, but nevertheless essentially correctly, then advocated that the Peenemünde should be bombed. At that point, Winston turned to Lord Cherwell, sitting over here, and asked him what he thought.
Cherwell maintained that the rocket was a German hoax. The white shapes on the photograph were either torpedoes or dummies designed to conceal another secret weapon. Churchill then asked Jones for his opinion.
And I proceeded to demolish, I had to demolish Lindeman's case, you see. Well, could it be could it be a torpedo? Well, it was 40-odd feet long. It would weigh, according to the expert estimates, 40 tons. There was no German aircraft that could pick it up. And this went on right the way through. If it was a hoax, what was the result of the hoax going to be? We would bomb Peenemünde, which was one of the main German Air Force experimental establishments, you see, and a German Army establishment as well. And every point that I made, there was this comedy that went on. And in the end, of course, Cherwell's case was substantially demolished.
Jones had won the day, and the decision was taken to bomb Peenemünde. On the night of the 17th of August 1943, nearly 600 bombers were dispatched to attack the plant. It was the only occasion in the war when the entire weight of Bomber Command was thrown into a single raid on a precision target. This was to be one of the first raids in which the Royal Air Force used a master bomber, who was to remain over the target throughout the attack, instructing the main force where to aim their bombs to achieve maximum concentration. Unfortunately, the new system proved fallible, as the target markers fell wide. The plant itself remained relatively unscathed, while the brunt of the attack fell on the housing and administrative blocks at Peenemünde. But the raid claimed some important individual victims. Among the 735 German dead was Professor Thiel, Peenemunde's chief engineer. 600 foreign workers also died. After the raid, British intelligence never received another report from an insider at Peenemünde. The raid set back the rocket program by about 2 months and prompted the Germans to move V weapon production to a safer location. In London, the British continued to track developments at Peenemünde. A committee was set up under the chairmanship of Stafford Cripps, a former ambassador to Moscow. After the Peenemünde raid, intelligence attention began to focus on the V1. The top-secret Y service, which eavesdropped on coded German radio, had been picking up the traffic of 2 highly specialized German radar units stationed on the Baltic coast. It was clear that the radar units were tracking the test firings of missiles developed at Peenemünde. careless references to the FZG-76 suggested that their task was to monitor the performance of a pilotless aircraft. Tantalizing reports from the French resistance mentioned winged rockets. They also named Colonel Max Wachtel as the officer chosen to launch some sort of campaign from northern France and Belgium. Details were coming in of mysterious ramps being constructed in the Pas-de-Calais area. Several of these sites were subjected to close scrutiny by gallant members of the French resistance. It was dangerous work, the threat of arrest and torture ever present. From occupied France, reports on the construction of the sites and the heavy anti-aircraft protection with which they were provided went back to London. But it was still unclear what sort of weapon the ramps would launch. Then aerial reconnaissance of one of Peenemunde's satellite stations at Zempin revealed similar ramps to those built in France and Belgium. The pieces in the intelligence jigsaw were coming together. And the last one was about to fall into place. It was put there by Constance Babington Smith, a PRU photo interpreter, who had been closely involved in monitoring the activity at Peenemünde.
But here are the three structures which had puzzled me so much. And you see from the shadow that they're at an angle. You can tell they're sloping. And on the central one here, this tiny little smudge linked up with the small aircraft I'd already seen. And measuring it with my measuring magnifier, I could tell that the span was just 20 feet. In other words, this was the evidence we had been waiting for. Here was the midget aircraft on a ramp, a launching ramp. It was known to us then as the Peenemünde 20. Later, of course, it was known to a great many more people as the V1.
British intelligence was also the beneficiary of a test V1, which had crashed on an island off the Danish coast and had been photographed in great detail. In December 1943, American and British bombers began a series of concerted attacks on the V1 launching sites in France. On Christmas Eve, over 1,000 aircraft dropped nearly 2,000 tons of bombs on the ramps and their associated buildings. Alarmed, Colonel Wachtel attempted to throw the Allies off the scent by moving his headquarters, changing his own name and that of his regiment, and finally dyeing his hair and growing a beard. But the French resistance kept track of the disguised Wachtel and his peripatetic headquarters and informed the British of their every move. In London, R.V. Jones and his team had initially estimated that the disruption caused to the V1 program would not permit the bombardment of the capital to begin before mid-March 1944. Jones had underestimated the problems caused by the bombing of Peenemünde and the transfer of the manufacturing of the V weapons to a huge underground factory in Germany's Harz Mountains. The Germans had planned to launch 500 V1s a day, but the Allied bombing campaign against the original sites had reduced their capability. It was not long before V1s fell to earth to reveal their secrets. The V1 was a surprisingly simple weapon, relatively cheap and easy to produce. It was driven by an Argus pulse jet, which had been patented in France as long ago as 1907, and in 1919 proposed as the power plant for a pilotless aircraft. The V1 could be launched from catapult ramps or aircraft and flew to its target at a height of 2,000 to 3,000 feet and a speed of 350 miles per hour. Its dive on a target, after a measured distance, was controlled by the revolutions of a small propeller. The V1 posed awkward problems for the British anti-aircraft defences, flying too high for light guns and too low for heavier artillery. The RAF's older fighters struggled to intercept them. At first, Britain's air defences were stretched to the limit. Anti-aircraft guns were rushed from London to the south coast. They were now firing new American-produced proximity fuses, which gave the guns the accuracy they had previously lacked. Of the 4,000 V1s eventually brought down over southern England, about half were accounted for by artillery coordinated by radar. For the V1s which successfully ran the gauntlet of the guns, there were more obstacles waiting for them inland. The cables of tethered barrage balloons, which had stood sentry over Britain's cities since 1939, claimed another 230 V1s. But most of the remainder went to newer fighters, like the Hawker Tempest, with a top speed of 435 miles per hour. Fighter pilots chasing the V1s had to have steady nerves. Closing with their fast-moving quarry, they opened fire at minimum range. There was another method fighter pilot Roland Beaumont recalls.
Which was tipping the V1 over by the wingtip of the fighter. And this happened, in my own case, when I'd used up my ammunition on one V1, saw another one, and decided to try and do something about it. And the method was to get your wingtip close underneath the wingtip of the V1, but not touching it, and then gradually raise your own wing to raise the airflow over it to affect the gyro stabilization of the V1. So you lifted your wingtip under the wingtip of the V1 and toppled it over, and it went in and crashed.
The RAF's first operational jet fighter, the Gloucester Meteor, made its combat debut against the V1. In all, RAF Fighter Command downed 1,771 V1s. One of the most spectacular and hazardous elements of the bomber war against the V1 was the destruction of the launching sites by remote control. War-weary B-24 Liberators and B-17 Flying Fortresses were packed with high explosive, transforming them into huge flying bombs containing nearly 30,000 pounds of torpex triggered by an impact fuse. The aircraft, codenamed Aphrodite, were flown by two pilots who set the fuses and then bailed out before the bomber crossed the English coast. The bomber then flew on, guided to its target by a control aircraft. Their power was shown when an Aphrodite piloted by Joe Kennedy Jr., older brother of the future US president, exploded prematurely. Blast damage extended over a radius of 6 miles. Many of the 6,200 V1s which came to Earth in England fell short of their main target, central London, as the result of an ingenious deception plan fostered by R.V. Jones. German military intelligence, the Abwehr, had ordered its agents in Britain to report on the fall of the V1s. Unknown to the Abwehr, the agents had been turned by the British and were now feeding their former masters with fabricated reports of overshoots. V1s which had exploded in South London were reported as landing in the north, so as to encourage the Germans to reduce their range. Wachtel was suspicious and suggested fitting a number of V1s with wireless transmitters so that their progress could be tracked. But his superiors placed such store by the agent's reports that he was overruled. As the Allies broke out of the Normandy bridgehead to race through northern France, the V1 launching sites were overrun. But the retreating Germans built new sites in the Netherlands. To the continued bombardment of southern England was added a Doodlebug blitz on the Belgian port of Antwerp, which had been liberated by the Allies in September 1944. Some 2,500 V1s were to fall on Antwerp. The menace of the V1s was not eliminated by the capture of their launching sites by the advancing Allies. The Germans had another trick up their sleeves. They began to launch V1s from bombers flying over the North Sea. About 1,000 were launched this way. But the bombers suffered heavy losses at the hands of RAF night fighters. Of the V1s which reached England, 2,400 fell on London. Damage was severe and widespread. The Doodlebugs killed over 6,500 people and badly injured 3 times more. The V1 campaign, R.V. Jones had not lost sight of the V2 threat. Aerial reconnaissance photographs taken of a new experimental station at Blizna in Poland showed a collection of colossal craters and then a rocket. The Polish resistance formed teams, which made it their business to reach crashed test missiles before the Germans. The information they obtained was relayed to London. And on the day that the first V1 fell in England, the 13th of June 1944, a wayward V2 crashed in Sweden. R.V. Jones' V2 file was growing fatter. By now, the dreaded German SS had taken over responsibility for the production of the V weapons in an underground factory at Nordhausen in the Harz Mountains. The huge factory was a latter-day cave of the Nibelungen. A small army of slave workers, housed in the nearby Dora concentration camp, provided forced labor. From Dora, the rockets would be taken by road or rail to their launch sites. But on the Eastern Front, the Russians were remorselessly driving the Germans back to the borders of the Reich. The test sites for the V2 were coming under threat as the German army fell back. Time was running out for Blizna. And in July 1944, it was overrun by the Russians. The British were keen to examine its secrets. The Soviet leader, Joseph Stalin, agreed that a British party should be allowed to inspect the site. There then followed a farcical but highly effective Russian exercise in stonewalling. A British team was warmly greeted at Blizna at the end of September 1944. The V2 parts they recovered were then lost by the Russians. When the crates finally turned up in England, they contained a collection of rusty aero engines. In the meantime, more V2 material was recovered from Poland. On the 20th of August, a V2 had come to Earth without exploding in a marsh 80 miles east of Warsaw. The Poles found it, pushed it deeper underwater, and when the German search parties moved on, they returned to salvage a number of vital parts. The parts were recovered from Poland by a British Dakota transport, flying from the southern Italian port of Brindisi. The Dakota then flew on to England with its precious cargo. On the German side, arguments had come to a head about the best method to deploy the V2. Von Braun and Dornberger favored mobile launches. But this raised the problem of assembling and servicing delicate mechanisms in the field, with all its drawbacks. Hitler, however, had long favored the construction of permanent and massive launch sites in northern France. The construction of two huge sites at Viserne and Watten in the Pas-de-Calais began in October 1943. The dome at Viserne, La Coupole, the cupola, was soon to loom over the landscape. La Coupole was designed as a complete launch system, with the disassembled V2s arriving by rail through an underground tunnel. The rockets would then be assembled and armed in a vast workshop below the dome. From this they would move upright to the launch pads. It was planned to launch 50 V2s every 24 hours. From March 1944, British and American aircraft subjected the site at La Coupole to a constant pounding. But the Allied bombers could make hardly a dent in its massive concrete carapace. Nevertheless, they tilted the great lid out of alignment and churned the site into a lunar landscape. The Allies overran northern France before the massive V2 sites had fired a single rocket. In September 1944, the British and Americans tried to bounce the Rhine in an ambitious airborne operation which came to grief at Arnhem. Most of Holland remained in German hands as a potential launch area for mobile V2s. These mobile launch sites needed little more than a concrete hardstanding and a command vehicle, and presented acute problems for the Allies. The V2 enjoyed mobility and freedom from attack, except when being transported from the factory. After launch, the V2 could not be intercepted, climbing to a height of 60 miles before descending at up to 4 times the speed of sound, setting up a huge double boom which heralded its arrival. Only a disabled V2 was ever filmed during its descent. It was only in November 1944 that the War Cabinet came clean with the British public about the V2. The government had been terrified of mass panic. At one point, the evacuation of the entire population of London had been considered. The most effective countermeasure was to attack the V2s while they were being transported across Europe to their launching sites. The V2 campaign reached a climax in February 1945, when 232 landed in southern England. Altogether, 1,115 fell, 517 of them in the London area. The last 2 exploded in March 1945. In all, the rockets killed nearly 3,000 people. as with the V1, the city of Antwerp was also bombarded with V2s. The threat was not removed until the Allied advance through northern Europe eventually pushed the V2 back beyond its maximum range of 220 miles. The rocket had been designed at the cutting edge of technology. Its gyroscopic guidance system was far in advance of anything in the Allied armory, and the electric torque motor which drove the gyros was the smallest of its kind. But each V2 cost 20 times more than the V1 to deliver just 1 ton of high explosive. In 7 months, the V2s had transported barely 500 tons of high explosive to London. In contrast, by the end of the war, British and American bomber aircraft were capable of delivering up to 8,000 tons to a single German city in a single combined attack. For all the brilliance of its design, the V2 was a prodigal waste of high technology. It's been suggested that some V2s were to be modified to carry more sinister chemical, biological, even nuclear weapons. This is a subject on which Wernher von Braun remained pointedly silent in his memoirs. Developments of the V2 could have been armed with irradiated waste material from Germany's own atom bomb program, although this lagged years behind that of the Allies. In sufficient quantities, these crude nuclear weapons could have turned tracts of southern England into irradiated deserts. Perhaps this might explain the huge size and complexity of a site like that at Watten, with its associated tracking station. These gigantic sites fell into Allied hands before the V2 launch program came on stream. With them died German hopes of a new super missile, designated the A-10, which was to use the V2 as a second stage and could have reached New York. Logic suggests that these too would have carried something more sinister than high explosive. The colossal effort involved in their development and production would not have been justified by a 1-ton conventional warhead. The super rocket joined the long list of Adolf Hitler's unrealized secret weapons, with which he had vainly hoped to postpone Germany's inevitable defeat. On VE Day, crowds celebrated the end of the war in Europe. Captured V weapons were displayed in London's Trafalgar Square, while the RAF flew triumphantly over the enemy it had done so much to defeat. But ironically, the real winner in the story of the V weapons may well have been Wernher von Braun. With his entire research team, he surrendered to the Americans. In the post-war years, von Braun was to become the father of the American space program.
Unravel the mysteries of our planet's remarkable evolution. Earth Story, a major series premiere, launches the Prehistory season tonight at 9 on UK TV History. More Secrets of World War II on UK TV History next.